fantasy short stories. Of Portals and Portents by Lesley Herron. Chapter 24, Gypsum. Without warning, Vel's mechanical hand jerked away from his body and slammed the point of the screwdriver into the tailgate of the pickup he had been sitting on, pushing it clean through.
Warning. Logical error detected. Locating source.
Vel let out a growl of frustration. Nothing was working. His cybernetic eye had been constantly flickering to black and then back to normal, and his mechanical arm was refusing to obey him 75% of the time. This being one such moment, his middle fingers twitched and spasmed, the resulting glitch nearly causing him to chuck the tiny screwdriver into oblivion. He plucked it free with his left hand just as his right gave another violent jerk, slamming his fist down over the hole he had created in the truck bed. In all the chaos that surrounded him, he was thankful to have found someone willing to lend him their tools to dissect the portal locker, as long as he remained within the vicinity of their vehicle. His vision began to clear, and Vel felt the tremors in his mechanical arm subside. He winced as he pulled his hand away to reveal the damage. He felt bad, but as rusted as the old truck was, he doubted they would notice. "It's not getting any better, Amy."
Why would it? You won't allow me to finish assessing the abnormalities that led to my critical failure in the first place.
And I already told you it's because this world has magic. It's not a fault in your system. Vel let out a huff. Can't you just bypass anything that doesn't work like usual?
Of course. I shall simply alter my understanding of physics and adapt your systems accordingly. Oh, wait. That's what I was trying to do when you turned me back on. If you would allow me to return to offline mode, I could...
Overlooking the snide tone in her remark, Vel shook his head. No time. She was in a mood, and arguing with her would get him nowhere. Just help me figure this damn thing out. He returned his attention to the mess of components strewn across the tailgate. While his left hand wasn't quite as deft as his mechanical one, which had pinpoint accuracy thanks to Amy, he had been a lefty before his accident. He plucked up the screwdriver and returned to the task. The inner workings of this device were nothing like he had ever seen before, and between Amy's constant nagging and dire warnings and the occasional glitch in his vision, Vel was struggling to figure the whole thing out. Between the two of them, he had managed to identify most of what was needed, and he was fairly confident he could get it to work. But it was always a good habit to exercise caution when ripping open holes in the universe, and there were still some aspects Amy couldn't wrap her brain around. Vel scratched at his temple with the end of the screwdriver as he stared down into the mess of cables and wires. Maybe it would be more helpful if you just pull up Eric's schematics again and, I don't know, highlight what's missing. He felt his mechanical hand twitch and glanced down at it warily.
If I may offer a suggestion.
He was ready to chastise her once more, when she pulled open a schematic and the familiar outline of his brother's portal device flared to life in front of him. She then pulled up the scans of the new one and offered him a side-by-side comparison, allowing him to locate the missing elements. Vel smirked. Maybe she would say something helpful this time. What's up?
If you allow me to just finish repairing my internal models, perhaps I could lend you a better understanding of how this device worked.
Rolling his eyes, Vel grunted in disappointment. I know you're not happy about all this. I'm not either. But I have to find the kids, and I can't do that without you. His left hand clenched into a fist around the tool as he glared down at the inner workings of the device. Please, don't tell me to return you to safe mode. Not yet. I can deal with a few glitches here and there, and I actually feel physically better now that you're back on. It was true. The massive fatigue had alleviated with the return of her presence, and his many cybernetics no longer felt sluggish.
The glitches are a symptom, and being online is pulling my processing power in several directions. The error in my system has affected my logic sectors, and may result in total failure of my consciousness if I do not return to repair mode.
Her words sent an icy chill down his spine, and Vel looked at his mechanical fingers with hesitation. Did that mean she could die? And if she did, what would happen to him? A flood of understanding filled him, but he shook his head once more. This was just too important.
Amy, it's been almost a week since all of this.
He paused, gesturing at his surroundings. People, lost and frightened, shuffled around like the undead between food stalls and supply stations. His shoulders slumped when his gaze landed on the Queen and her bodyguard, offering blankets and a comforting word or hug to those who approached.
7 days is too long for the kids to be out there on their own and be okay. I have to find them. After that, we can shut you back down. Deal?
I cannot guarantee I will last that long.
Well, that solidified his resolve. He had to get moving. While they had figured out enough of the device to set a destination, even if they were certain it wouldn't disintegrate him upon entry, it was still a risk. Vel set the portal device between his legs and, thankful he was left-handed for this, began reassembling the delicate inner workings. A twist here, a turn there, and within 10 minutes, he had managed to fine-tune the dial to the earlier coordinates that Amy had calculated the kids may have ended up at after the storm.
There is only a 64% chance that this will work, and your odds of surviving this are even less.
Vel slid the panel back on the machine and set his jaw.
Amy, I have to go find the kids. Please, they...
And if you survive the jump and find nothing, then what?
Then I'll keep trying until...
The edges around his cybernetic vision grew dark, blackening inwards as he made to jump off the back of the truck. Instead, he lost his footing and collapsed in a heap to the ground. The wind knocked from his lungs. He lay there in the dirt and gravel, waiting for his eyesight to return. After a few moments, a firm grip around his mechanical arm pulled him up, and he turned to see the vague outline of the Dryad, Undine, setting him on his feet. Pyra approached, finishing the last loops of the braid in her hair. "Why were you on the ground?"
I didn't do it on purpose.
Vel snorted as he dusted himself off. He did a double take, staring Pyra up and down.
What are you wearing?
What, this? With the promise of a little coin, she had managed to acquire some proper travel attire that thankfully included shoes. Her feet were so sore and blistered from their time exposed to the elements and the rocks. "I was told it was the local fashion. Do you like it?" Vel chuckled. She was wearing high-waisted jeans, sneakers, and a baggy t-shirt with a logo for a band called Death Kittens. All she needed was a poofy haircut, and she could have fallen out of an old TV sitcom.
Yeah, it fits you.
As Pyra beamed, Undine rolled her eyes. The Dryad had donned her armor once more, rather than try the local fashion. She held out the man's long red coat, offering it up to him. "Well, we are ready to leave." Taking the garment, Vel slid one arm in and then the other, before the words hit him.
Leave? Where are you going?
"Sabine is sending a small group, with horses, to the Infinite Tower to get some answers, as she called it. And she has made extra accommodations for us so that we may return with them." Pyra felt something clamp tight around her gut. The last time she had seen the tower, an entire city had appeared nearby, nearly killing her in the process. She had no idea what they would find. And, perhaps, She was afraid to hear what answers Elias might provide.
Using the portal device is unquestionably risky, but were you to travel to the destination by foot, 7 days, or even by horse, 4, you would arrive safe and uninjured. And during that time, I could power down my non-essential systems and continue repairs.
Vel glanced over at the Queen. She hid it well, but she was nervous and scared. That look, that face that reminded him so much of Piper, drove the feeling into his heart like a stake, and his grip around the portal device tightened. He shook his head.
Good luck on your journey, but I won't be going with you.
Pyra, busy twisting the braid around on her head into a bun, stopped and looked over at him. What? Why not?
I have to find the kids.
Every word was soaked with a desperation that hadn't been there when Vel first uttered those words to her. He held up the portal locker to show her.
I think I have this mostly figured out, and I'm gonna give it a try.
Then we will go with you. Pyra said these words before she even knew what caused her to say them. Perhaps it was that look on his face, or the sadness in his voice, but she knew that feeling, and it echoed within her. Vel shook his head.
I'm not even sure it will work. It could be dangerous.
Your Majesty, I do not think this is wise. Undine turned, her face pulling into one of concern. The country will need your guidance, now more than ever. If you do not wish to return to the tower, to your husband, then you should at least rejoin the council in Bastion Hall. Pyra sighed. She knew her duty was to her people, to those displaced by this recent tragedy. But she also couldn't let this broken man out into the wilds on his own. And then the solution clicked in place when she realized the two were not exclusive. If this portal magic works, then I could be in either place within hours rather than days. She turned back to the half-elf. Correct? Vel nodded slowly.
In theory, but I can't promise it will work at all. It might send me into the middle of nowhere.
In which case you would need our help. You saved my life. I would be remiss not to offer my aid now. She turned to the Dryad. I have made my choice, Undine. I will go with him. However, you are free to make your own decision. If you do not wish to join me, then perhaps you will find what you seek with the caravan. Undine bit her tongue and nodded. Stepping out from a darkened alley, Theodore slapped his palm into the back of a passing soldier's skull. And, as the man crumpled comically to the ground, he grabbed an exposed ankle and dragged him back into the darkened space, pushing him into a pile of rubbish. The resulting waft of putrid smell caused Theodore to wrinkle his nose and turn away, gazing back to the street. He could see, not far away, a long metal spire erected at the edge of the city. As far as he could tell, it looked like some odd type of communication tower. Back before the coup, Elias had shown him an entire division dedicated to the advancement of such things. While the design was different, it bore many similarities to several things he had seen, even if it was rough around the edges. The Brotherhood had been quick with their installation of these towers, this one just as slipshod as the last. A simple wooden barricade around its base supported the wires that anchored the 20-foot radio antenna to the ground. Elias had taught him that a well-organized army needed one thing above all else: communication. If he was able to cripple their radio towers, it would leave them scrambling. The only trick was doing so without being caught. He looked back down at the soldier he had stashed, and a smile curled his lips. Theodore reached in and wrenched free the man's Brotherhood robe and threw it over his own clothes. It was a tight fit and smelly now, but it could pass casual inspection. He smirked down at the unconscious soldier. This one, like the others, would most likely be out for the better part of the day. Stroking his chin with his good hand, Theodore shrugged and strolled up to the tower like he belonged. He popped open the box of cables that sat near the base of the pole and wrapped his hand around a fistful of thick wires. Sparks flew as he ripped them free, singeing the fabric around his wrists, but he felt no pain. He stashed the torn cables back inside their box and closed it with a satisfied grunt. With any luck, nobody would think anything had happened. He looked back towards the alley. There was no sign of movement from within, and, from his viewpoint, the soldier was well hidden. Good. This would allow him to continue his plan unnoticed. Glancing towards the horizon, the long shadows cast by the buildings shielded his eyes against the sun. He could see the glimmering of another radio tower several blocks north. He shook his head. Either the range on these things was abysmal, or the Brotherhood believed in deceptive might. They had installed one every few hundred feet. While he wanted to give them credit for this redundancy, it just made his job that much harder. Most likely the point, Theodore thought with a huff. It wasn't a bad way to combat sabotage. Invisible at last, no one gave him a second glance as he walked. He turned off down the street in the direction of the radio tower. As he did, the fabric sleeves tugged at his injured arm, sending shards of pain deep into the bones of his body, and his mind shifted to his sister. He had promised her he would find a solution. She had the manacles, yes, but that was nothing more than a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. He needed something stronger, something permanent. He had a plan. Help Elias retake the city, then have the king ship them both off to a world where magic couldn't turn their bodies into a crystal prison. But as he walked, the sheer might of the Brotherhood began to poke holes in his plan. In a week, they had taken control of the city, even if Chester couldn't see it, with metal machines patrolling the main roads and armed soldiers at every corner. What could Elias do against all this? Theodore looked down at the cassock, the symbol of the Brotherhood gleaming up at him in golden embroidery. It was more than just military might. They had brought in the resources used to repair the city, and everywhere he looked, there were signs of their advanced technology saving lives, making things more bearable. They had won the hearts of the people, and with such wonders, perhaps they might be able to help him and his sister. If his father trusted them, then couldn't he? He rounded the corner to see the same clumsy wooden barrier holding the supports for this radio tower, and a single guard snoozing against the gate. Perhaps they would be able to cure them. They owed the Prime Minister that much for being handed the city on a platter. As he mulled this over, he grabbed the dozing guard by the collar and introduced his face to the nearest wooden beam. The soldier slumped to the ground with no complaint, and he looked up at the tower once more as he opened the wooden box at its base. His fingers had just wrapped around the cables when a shot rang out, and he felt something glance off his shoulder. He turned to see that same guard, dumped in a trash heap, stumbling up the street behind him, his undergarments flapping in the breeze.
Get away from there, and get on the ground, now!
Theodore smirked and raised his hands above his head, calmly walking the several steps towards the man.
You misunderstand, my friend. I just caught this one here trying to sabotage. Bang!
He felt the bullet bounce off his chest harmlessly. That was new. He had always been resilient, but a bullet should have at least took a chunk out of him.
Hey now,
Bang! With a sigh, he began stalking forward, feeling every bullet emptied from the gun glance off his skin. He reached out and snatched the gun away, snapping the metal tube in half using his bare hands. The soldier's eyes went wide with fear a millisecond before he was knocked unconscious by the butt of the gun. As he tossed the shattered weapon to the side, Theodore shook his head. Even if they could help, they could just as likely decide to kill everyone as soon as they had what they wanted. He had heard too many stories of the Brotherhood to think that their generosity was anything more than a tactical ploy. He returned to the cable box. He couldn't even trust his own father, much less an obsessed religious cult. He pulled open the door and slammed his hand inside, repeating the process that had disabled the previous radio tower. No. He knew where to find the solution to his problem. The king was a great man, no doubt, and he and his Wonder Twin could easily open a portal into a world with no magic. Somewhere Theodore and his sister could spend their days, not having to worry about this crystal disease. 2 transmitters down, but how many more did he need to destroy in order to cripple communications within the Brotherhood? Elias had told him to prepare for an invasion, for his forces to overtake the city once he rallied the Selkies to his side. He appreciated the man's confidence in him, but how the hell was he supposed to achieve that? Taking out their communications was one thing, but opening a path into this heavily guarded city would be an entirely new beast. Theodore stroked his chin, falling deep into thought. Maybe he could cause mayhem on the northern edge of the city and draw their forces away. He could handle that, right? Destroy a few towers along the way to dismantle an egress point, then see if he could liberate one of their siege weapons. Well, it wasn't a good plan, but hey, it was something. If the Selkies could navigate their way in via river, the least guarded area in the city, then they had a head start at any rate. That would allow Elias and his armies to rejoin them on foot, because only an idiot would try to fly an airship into the city. It was huge, visible all the way from the horizon, and maneuvered like a flying whale.
Boom!
The ground shook beneath his feet, and several of the support cables for the radio tower snapped, sending the 20-foot rod crashing to the ground. With a roll of his eyes, Theodore pressed his back against the nearest building and looked up. Of course they would be entering the city that way, he thought, as he looked up to see the fractured remains of their airship. Blasted into 3 pieces, the vessel was piecing itself back together with thick vines as it rocked on a sea of purple haze. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Theodore let out a long groan. Well, there went his current plan. He ripped off the Brotherhood cassock and tossed it on the nearest unconscious guard before jogging off in the direction of the ship. His heavy paws impacted the ground like rhythmic war drums, kicking up clouds of dirt and leaves as his presence was heralded by the rippling vibrations in the earth. Barry panted hot blasts of air like a furnace, each thundering stride sending wildlife scurrying for miles around. His mind burned with a singular purpose: rescue his friend. Without him there to talk sense into the Arcanist, Atlas was likely to try something dumb, like tying his shade to a fire spell again. He let out a grumble of rage. He was one half of a duo, the logic to the chaos. 2 peas in a pod of magical mischief. If he got there and his friend had blown himself up, he would figure out how to resurrect him just so he could kill him. A nagging thought tickled at his mind. How would he deal with Elias? Or the doctor? Both of them had gone off the deep end, and neither one could be reasoned with. Well,
Whatever he did, he would do it with gravitas. And may the goddess have mercy on them if they chose to stand in his way, or anyone else for that matter, because he certainly would not.
Error.
Vel stepped out of the portal and stumbled, falling to his knees. The world was spinning around and around, alarms blaring in his mind, and his vision flickered like a strobe light. It was all too much for him. He crawled several feet and retched. Traveling the multiverse with his brother had allowed Vel to experience all manner of different portal varieties throughout his years. Most of them were uncomfortable, squeezing him into near suffocation or forcing him to swim through molasses. But there were a few odd ones that stood out, and even fewer still that could be labeled as pleasant. But this was a whole new experience for him. The device, similar to Eric's in design, didn't use just science. It also factored in magic. This allowed them to simply walk through, nearly instantaneously, to arrive anywhere within this realm. A form of travel that Vel normally wouldn't have had a problem with. But it was too fast, too fluid, and sickening. And, as Amy had guessed, the magic played havoc with her systems. She was not coping well, and it took everything as he dug his fingers into the mud and grass to keep from feeling like he was about to fly off the face of the planet. Over the rushing in his ears, he heard 2 nearby pops and assumed the queen and her bodyguard were hot on his heels.
Ugh, I do not like this form of travel.
Undine stepped out first, holding her hand up behind her to help Pyra out of the swirling gate. Once free from the portal, it snapped back into a thin blue line before dissipating into nothing.
But, by Tiara's grace, we survived.
She spun around, unsure of where they had landed. There was no sign of the Silver City they had just left, or the strange floating disk in the sky she had seen before. She couldn't even see the smoky black mountain range that was home to Bastion Hall.
Do you know where we are?
Pyra looked around, just as lost as the Dryad. They were standing in a small clearing of a dense forest. The foliage looked odd, but some of the plants were familiar to Ebra. Without any landmarks, however, she had no clues to answer her questions. Undine had hoped their current destination would have put them closer to their goal, but it appeared they were not so lucky. She shook her head and placed her hand on the nearest tree. She held it there for a long moment, closing her eyes and breathing in deep through her nose. But after several minutes, she pulled her hand away with a short growl.
No, and the trees here are being stubborn. They will not speak to me.
Barely aware of their exchange, Vel steadied himself as he clutched at his head with one hand, his other attempting to push him out of the mud. Amy had settled down now that the portal had closed, and she was busy calculating the magical frequencies around them, trying to adjust for all the variables. But his vision still swam in and out of focus, the edges growing dark or glitching altogether. It was no use. Despite his best efforts, he retched again, vomiting up the remainder of his stomach contents and collapsing back to the ground.
Vel?
Pyra stopped her pondering in time to see the cyborg fall to his side in the tall grass. She tapped gently on the Dryad's shoulder to grab her attention.
Something is wrong.
Exhaling with an aggravated snort, Undine moved to the mumbling man and hoisted him to his feet.
Relax, will you? I will get one of these trees to talk to me and find out where we are.
When he failed to acknowledge her, she tapped his cheeks firmly to grab his attention.
All right? System malfunction. Attempting to compensate. Offline mode is suggested.
He closed his eyes against the nauseating vertigo and collected himself. Vel had come this far. Now was not the time to fall to pieces. Once he found the kids, he'd take Amy up on that offer to go offline for a bit. But he owed it to them to press on. He swallowed that lump and gave the dryad a weak nod of understanding. Undine removed her hands from his shoulders, and he felt his feet steady beneath him. Sucking in a deep breath for confidence, Vel began turning on the spot, scanning his surroundings.
"Piper? Atticus?"
His first shout was cracked and tiny, so he moved his hand to cup around his mouth and called for them again, but heard only his echo in response. He spun again, squinting through the darkness between the trees. That lump settled into his core and began to grow. He ignored the urge to vomit and called out once more. Unease had blossomed into panic, and his fingers and toes began to tingle. He jogged a few paces towards the tree line, shouting their names, but only silence replied.
"Amy, did we make it to the right spot?"
Cursory data suggests accurate location. In-depth analysis not recommended at this time.
Taking several deep, steadying breaths, Vel tried to calm his nerves. That was a good thing, right? Nobody here means that maybe they outran the storm and made it to their mom. Or that tendril of dark thoughts crept back into his mind. Maybe they had been blown off course and were out there, somewhere else entirely, lost and waiting for him to show up. Panic was back, and fear rushed through his veins. Vel looked down at the portal device in his hands. He could possibly use it to teleport to West Austria and check there, assuming Amy could make the trip, assuming that city had fared better than Avis, and assuming they were there at all. That was a lot of assumptions to hang his hopes on. But the worry was whisked away from him as he caught a whiff of a scent on the air. He stopped, his mind jarring to a halt as he inhaled deeper through his nose. It was campfire smoke, and that meant people. He felt his nerves calm, but elation tickled his fingertips, and he tore off after the smell, ignoring the calls from Pyra and Undine behind him. Within a minute, he burst out into a massive clearing where the grass and mud gave way to sand and water. It was a ginormous lake in the middle of the forest, and there, sitting half-sunk near the edge, was the gilded pleasure yacht. It was charred and still smoldering in places, the source of the smoke, with luggage littering the ground around it, or floating along the calm surface of the water like empty life preservers. Vel sank to his knees in the sand as the weight of what he was looking at slammed into him. His stomach churned, and he felt the bile rising in his throat, his vision not the cause of this sickness. Hot tears began to well up in his eyes as his breathing hitched in his throat. He had failed. Once again, he had failed to keep a promise he had made, and was now staring up at the charred hull of what he knew to be the kid's final resting place. This was all his fault. If he had never followed his brother into that stupid portal, none of this would have ever happened. They would still be alive, laughing and running on the streets of Avis. He clutched at his chest with his left hand and let out a wail of agony. As Pyra stepped out of the tree line, seeing him hunched over in the sand and trembling with noiseless sobs, she realized how important these children were to him. She followed his prints in the mud, through the grass, and reached out to touch his shoulder, to console him, but stopped short. She could see the burning wreckage, and could only imagine what was running through his mind. What words could she say that would help him in this moment? She settled on sitting in the sand beside him, placing her hand on his. She offered him only silence, because no words she could give would bring him comfort, but instead gripped him tight to let him know she was there for him if he needed. And, for a long time, the two remained there that way before the sound of clanking armor drew Pyra's attention back to the tree line. The look on the Dryad's face told her she had found something, but her hesitation was cause for concern. What? What is it? I have good news, and I have bad news. Vel swallowed the anguish in his throat, but refused to look up. He knew if his gaze crossed the remnants of the ship once more, he would lose his composure. Undine gestured off behind her. I still can't get anything to speak to me, save for the occasional slur about my heritage. I think these plants are a bit prejudiced, or at least very rude. She clicked her tongue against her teeth. Perhaps the local dryads don't take kindly to bastard royals. Undine, please. Pyra gave her a stern look, nodding at the distraught man beside her. You have news? The dryad's face grew serious. The good news is I found tracks in the mud. Many of them, small human-sized footprints. Dozens of them at least. It looks like whoever was on that ship survived the crash. Belle's gaze shot up. The bad news? They may have fallen prey to something else. Theirs were not the only tracks. By the looks of it, they were cut off by a horde of twisted. I saw paw prints mixed in with the boot impressions, and I'm certain even a set that belonged to an ogre. We thank you for joining us for this chapter of the novel of Portals and Portents, Book 4 by Lesley Herron in this ongoing series available here on Tall Tale TV. You can find links in the description to where you can listen to all her books and novellas, with new chapters appearing as they are being written and recorded.
Morning, Ethel.
G'day, Franklin. Down from Jebry's farm, are ya?
Oi, came into town for a spot of shopping. Pick up a few of them eggs you be peddling, and maybe one of your famous apple crumble pies while I'm at it. Tiara willin'.
No pies today, I'm afraid. My knee started acting up last night. Didn't get a lick of bacon done.
Your old haycart injury? Doesn't that only happen when a storm's brewing? Nothing but blue skies about.
Aye, usually. But sometimes it gets wonky if there's a drought or famine not far off.
Blimey, I hope that's not the case.
Once it warned me off a snake oil salesman what come through town.
Snake oil
Or
sales?
if bandits are on the road. Sometimes if a distant relative is about to pass away. If the milk's gone sour.
Uh-huh. Is that all?
Aye, that's all.
Right. Well, then I better hurry back home before a snake oil bandit poisons my famished relative via sour milk in the middle of a storm. 4 eggs, please. What in the 5 hells? Oh, God! Oh! Run for your lives!
Oh, right. I forgot about bears. I always forget about bears.